All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, we got to talk about Epstein because that's what everybody's talking about. But I wanted to look real quick at some of these other high profile prostitution ring cases and look at the kind of outcomes that came out of it. So you can kind of see what's been going on with the Epstein thing, too. Now, first we got this Heidi Fleiss. She was considered the Hollywood Madam. And basically, she was married to some old Hollywood guy, this guy, when she was 22 years old. And he worked on Chips and Starsky and Hutch. So obviously, he's much older than her. And basically, she started working as a prostitute under this other woman, Madam Alex. Learned how to be a prostitute, and then all of Madam Alex's prostitutes aged out of the business. And that's when Heidi Fleiss came in the clutch and started recruiting new, young, attractive women. Now, how young they were, who knows? It just says new, young, right? So basically, she was caught in a sting operation. But here's the interesting part about it. It says federal charges were filed in 1994 and Fleiss posted $1 million bail. The state trial began the same year and Fleiss was convicted. In 1995, Hollywood actor Charlie Sheen testified against Fleiss, admitted to paying $53,000 for her services between 1991 and 1993. Now, what you'll notice from that is that Hollywood actor Charlie Sheen testified against the pimp. I will just say pimp in this case because it's a non-gendered term, right? And he admitted to paying, $53,000 for escorts, but yet he's not getting arrested, put in jail, anything like that. So something like this might be happening in the Epstein case, where some of these more high-profile people testified against Epstein in return for, basically like protection or what's it called? Immunity, right? And then another interesting side note is that she's basically become like a TV personality and she was always in Hollywood. Like you can see here where it's like, she started out with this guy that's a TV producer. So this guy that's a TV producer is dating a prostitute slash pimp that's recruiting young women into the business. And then she goes on to, make numerous TV appearances. Oh, she was also married to Tom Sizemore, right? And then she tried to start her own like prostitution ranch in Nevada, but she got shut down. So then instead of starting a prostitution ring in Nevada, now she owns a private airport, which is just another interesting side fact. Where does it say that? As of April 2025, and since at least January 2017, Fleiss owns and manages the Flying S Ranch Ultralight Flight Park and Ultralight Private Use Airport. Right, so she owns a private airport where they park private jets. So she's in the TV industry. Like, look at how many TV appearances she's made. And all these are after 1995. Like, she didn't even really start getting into TV until after she was arrested for the prostitution ring, right? And it kind of seems like she's getting rewarded because one of the things that it says here is that she never gave up the names of any of the clients. See, Fleiss's ring reportedly had numerous prominent and wealthy clients. Sound familiar? When questioned by British television presenter Davina McCall about revealing the names of her clients, she replied, "It's not my style." Right? So The famous people that testified against her, even admitting that they used her services, no jail time, no arrest. In fact, they got rewarded basically for testifying against her. She never revealed the names of the clients. She was married to two prominent Hollywood figures. She was also banging Charlie Sheen, of course. And now she owns a private airport. And she's been on TV numerous times after being arrested, right? Then you go to the internet and you go, what men were put in jail for the Hollywood Madam? It's like, nobody, not one. Nobody has. Okay, so then we go to this more recent one, Deborah Jean Palfrey. Now, she's considered the DC Madam. She owned and operated, escort service in Washington, D.C. She was convicted of racketeering and money laundering. And then she was found hanged dead. Wow. Okay, so she died. Basically, they set her up, and then they found out that she was doing money laundering. But the fact of the matter is that she obviously had a lot of high-profile politicians, and here we go. The 2016 presidential election, Montgomery Blair Sibley, Palfrey's former attorney, claimed her phone records were relevant to the 2016 presidential election. Interesting. In April 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the request to lift a lower court order made by the then D.C. judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit on Merrick Garland, in place since 2007, that bars Sibley from releasing any information about her records. So she can't even reveal who the prominent DC politicians and celebrities are that used her services. And she was saying that it was irrelevant to the 2016 election, meaning that someone in the 2016 election, presidential election, used her services, and she's not allowed to reveal who it was. She's not allowed to. She's like, oh, I'll tell you all the names. They're like, nope, you can't do it. A DC chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit bars her from releasing any information about her records. Wow. Right? So this is what's going on, right? This is what's going on. They're not even allowed. Even if she wanted to tell, she could get in more trouble for revealing. And then she died by suicide and hanging. Come on. DC madam who vowed not to go to prison kills herself. Police officially conclude DC madam hanged herself. Yeah, okay. So you can see what's going on here. These people become like the fall guy, and then they get taken out, and then nobody knows who went there. There's all these prostitutes, all these clients, but not one of their names gets revealed. Not one of them, right? And look, I know it sucks. It's like you'd think that people would get in trouble. What men were put in jail in the DC Madam case? No men were charged or jailed in connection with Deborah Jean Palfrey's escort services, despite several high-profile clients being identified, including politicians. Palfrey was the only person convicted and faced a prison sentence before her death. Sound familiar? It does kind of sound familiar, right? The money laundering, racketeering, high-profile politicians involved in the 2016 election, and then she just happens to kill herself right before the trial, even though she was totally okay with releasing all the names of all the high-profile politicians. Hmm. Definitely not a conspiracy. Definitely not. So we can see the results of these other high profile cases, and you can kind of see what's going on with the Epstein thing a little bit more. And maybe that's what's happening. Like they're getting the Charlie Sheen treatment. A lot of these high profile celebrities, that's what they might be getting, that type of treatment. Where, oh, well, I guess you testified against him. So now, even though you said that you were banging the escorts too, we're going to let you go. All right. Time to get into the book here. Like I'm saying, like it's obvious that they were banging people. Like the Epstein thing, it's obvious. But what's not so obvious is what's going to happen to the people that did it. Because it doesn't seem like anything's going to happen. And I know that sucks. I know you don't want to hear that. But, all right. So we're on The New Era, 1957 to 1964, page 1183 at the top of the page. The economic problems of the new nations are already clear. In most cases, they center upon the imbalance between a rapidly growing population and a limited food supply, with the accessory problem of finding employment for such additional population in their underdeveloped economic status. Technical knowledge is limited, and large-scale illiteracy hampers the spread of such knowledge, if it exists. But in most cases, it does not exist, for it must be emphasized that the technical knowledge built up in Europe and America under quite different geographic and social conditions is often not applicable to colonial areas. This was made brutally clear in the so-called ground nut scheme in British East Africa in the early post-war period, which sought to grow peanuts over a vast acreage using American methods of tractor cultivation. It led to disastrous results, with monetary losses of many hundreds of millions of dollars. Any technology must fit into the natural and social ecology of the situation. The conditions of most ex-colonial areas are so different from those of Western Europe and North America that our methods should be applied only with the greatest caution. American methods, in particular, are usually based on scarce and high-cost labor combined with plentiful and cheap material costs to provide labor-saving but material-wasteful methods of production requiring large savings and heavy investment of capital. Almost all ex-colonial areas have an oversupply of cheap and unskilled labor with limited material and land resources and are in no position to raise or utilize heavy capital investments. As a consequence, quite different technological organizations must be devised for these areas. The social consequences of decolonization are, in some ways, similar to those that have appeared recently in the poorer areas of Western cities. This has been called anomie, the shattering of stable social relationships, and arises from rapid social change rather than from decolonization. It gives rise to isolation of individuals, destruction of established social values and of stability, personal irresponsibility, shattered family relationships, irresponsible sexual and parental relationships, crime, juvenile delinquency, a greatly increased incidence of all social diseases, including alcoholism, the use of narcotics, and neuroses, and personal isolation, loneliness, and susceptibility to mass hysteria. The crowding of large numbers of recently detribalized individuals into rapidly growing African cities has shown these consequences, as, indeed, they have been shown in many American cities, such as New York or Chicago, where recently deruralized people are exposed to somewhat similar conditions of anomie. Some of the more intractable difficulties of newly decolonized areas are psychological, especially as these difficulties are hard to identify and often provide almost superable obstacles to development programs, usually to those directed along Western lines. It is, for example, not usually recognized that the whole economic expansion of Western society rests upon a number of psychological attitudes that are prerequisites to the system as we have it, but are not often stated explicitly. Two of these may be identified as 1. Future preference, and 2. Infinitely expandable material demand. In a sense, these are contradictory, since the former implies that Western economic man will make almost any sacrifice in the present for the sake of some hypothetical benefit in the future, while the latter implies almost insatiable material demand in the present. Nonetheless, both are essential features of the overwhelming Western economic system. Future preference came out of the Christian outlook of the West, and especially from the Puritan tradition, which was prepared to accept almost any kind of sacrifice and self-discipline in the temporal world for the sake of future eternal salvation. The process of secularization of Western society since the 17th century shifted that future benefit from eternity to this temporal world, but did not otherwise disturb the pattern of future preference and self-discipline. In fact, these became the chief psychological attributes of the middle class that made the Industrial Revolution and the great economic expansion of the West. They made people willing to undergo long periods of sacrifice for personal training and to restrict their enjoyments of income for the sake of higher training and for capital accumulation. This made it possible to develop an advanced technology with massive shifting of economic resources from consumption to forming capital equipment. On this basis, Quakers, Puritans, and Jews built the early railroad systems, and English nonconformists combined with Scottish Presbyterians to build the early iron industry and steam engine factories. Other advances were based on these. The mass production of this new industrial system was able to continue and to accelerate to the fantastic rate of the 20th century because Western man placed no limits on his ambition to create a secular, earthly paradise. Today, the average middle-class family of suburbia has a schedule of future material demands which is limitless. A second car is essential, followed by a third. An elaborate reconstruction of the basement provides a recreation room, which must be followed in short order by an elaborate patio with outdoor cooking equipment and a swimming pool. Almost immediately comes the need for an outboard motorboat and trailer to carry it, followed by the need for a summer residence by the water and a larger boat. And so it goes in an endless expansion of insatiable demands spurred on by skilled advertising, the whole keeping the wheels of industry turning and the purchasing power of the community racing around it in an accelerating cycle. Without these two psychological assumptions, the Western economy would break down or would never have started. At present, future preference may be breaking down, and infinitely expanding material demand may soon follow it in the weakening process. If so, the American economy will collapse unless it finds new psychological foundations. The connection of all this with ex-colonial areas lies in the fact that without these two attitudes, it will be very difficult for underdeveloped nations to follow along the Western path of development. This does not mean that no achieving society can be constructed without these two attitudes. Not at all. Many different attitudes, in proper arrangement, might be made the basis for an achieving society, but it would probably not be along the Western lines of individual initiative and private enterprise. Religious feelings or national pride or many other attitudes could become the basis for achievement and economic expansion, as they were in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt or in medieval Europe, but such other bases for achievement would be unlikely to provide a system using private savings as its method of capital accumulation or personal ambition as its method for acquisition of highly developed technological training and skills as in our economy. The ordinary African is very remote from either future preference or infinitely expandable material demands. He generally has preference for the present, and his demands are often non material and even non economic, such as his desire for leisure or for social approval. The African has a fair recognition of the immediate past, a dominant concern for the present, and little concern for the future. Accordingly, his conception of time is totally different from that of the average Western man. The latter sees the present only as a moving point of no dimension that separates the past from the future. The African sees time as a wide gamut of the present with a moderate dimensioned past and almost no future. This outlook is reflected in the structure of the Bantu languages, which do not emphasize the tense distinctions of past, present, and future as we do, but emphasize categories of condition, including a basic distinction in the verb between completed and incompleted actions that places the present and the future, both concerned with unfinished actions, in the same category. We do this occasionally in English when we use the present tense in a future sense by saying, he is coming tomorrow. But this rare use of the present to indicate the future does not blur our conception of the future the way constant use of such constructions does in Bantu. In addition to his present preference, the Bantu has a list of priorities in his conception of a higher standard of living, which contains many non-economic goals. A fairly typical list of such priorities might run thus: food, sex, dalliance, joking with one's friends, a bicycle, music, and dancing, a radio, leisure to go fishing. Any list such as this, with its high priority for non economic and basically leisure activities, does not provide the constantly expanding material demands that are motivating force in the West's economic expansion. Nor is the African's strongly socialized personality, which shares all its successes and wants with others and constantly yearns for the social approval obtained by sharing income with kinfolk and friends, capable of supporting any economy of private selfishness and individual capital accumulation that became the basis for the industrial expansion of the West. These remarks about the differences in African outlooks and our own could be applied also to the differences in the material basis for economic expansion, as we have already indicated. It is perfectly true that the obstacles we have mentioned do not apply to all Africans or to all parts of Africa, but in general it can be said that most Western methods and organizations do not fit the non-Western context of the newly independent countries, and that these differ so greatly from one another, or even in some cases, such as India, within a single nation, that the direct application of Western methods to these new areas is inadvisable. Such Western methods might work if native peoples could acquire some of the more basic attributes that have been the foundation of Western progress. For example, the victory of the West in World War II was attributed to our capacity for rationalization and for scientific method. These, in turn, rest on the most basic features of the Western outlook and traditions, on the way in which our cognitive system categorizes the world, and the value system we apply to this structure of categories. But our cognitive system is deprived from our past heritage, such as our Hebrew ethical system, the Christian heritage, which strangely enough made us accept the reality and the value of the temporal world at the same time that it placed our final goal, achievable through behavior in the world of the flesh, in the eternal world of the spirit. and the lessons of Greek rationalism with its insistence on dealing with the world in a quite artificial system of two-valued logic based on the principle of identity and the law of contradiction. Non-Western peoples who do not find in their own system of cognition any acceptance of the rules of identity or of contradiction do not see reality in terms of two-valued logic and must make an almost impossible effort to adopt the West's natural tendency to rationalize problems. On this basis, they find it difficult to either rationalize their own emotional position and thus to control or direct them, or to rationalize, which is to isolate and analyze, their problems and thus to seek solutions for them. Africans, for example, unless they have been thoroughly westernized, do not make the sharp distinctions we do between the living and the dead, between animate and non-animate objects, between deity and man, and many other distinctions which our long submission to Greek logic have made almost inevitable to us. In view of the similarity of the problem faced by the newly independent nations, it may seem curious that they have not shown a greater tendency to cooperate with each other or to attempt to form some kind of common front towards the world. The chief effort to do this has been in the form of a number of meetings of so-called uncommitted nations, of which the chief was held at Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, and a number of efforts to move towards some kind of pan-African system. On the whole, however, this effort towards cooperation has been blocked by three influences. One, the sensitivity of newly independent nations to preserve this independence intact as long as possible, even to the degree that particularist local interest and rivalries are dominant over common interest. Two, the fact that all these nations need economic aid and technical assistance from the advanced countries and are, on the whole, in competition with each other to get it. And three, the tendency of many of the newly independent areas, such as Indonesia or Egypt, to adopt pro-Soviet attitudes in the Cold War, leading to efforts by the Soviet Union to infringe upon their basic neutralist policies to persuade them to make a commitment to the communist side in the Cold War. In many ways, the problems of independence have a distinctly different character in Africa from Asia. In Asia, as is traditional along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, the structure of societies has been one in which a coalition of army, bureaucracy, landlords, and moneylenders have exploited a great mass of peasants by extortion of taxes, rents, low wages, and high interest rates in a system of such persistence that its basic structure goes back to the Bronze Age empires before 1000 BC. In Africa, the situation has been quite different and has generally been in constant flux. This results from a number of influences, of which one is that Africa has been underpopulated and has not developed the kind of land monopolization that supported Asiatic despotism. The dominant social units of African society have been kinship groups, extended families, lineages, clans, and tribes with land ownership, generally of little importance, vested in these and often with a fairly wide division between ownership and rights of usufruct. I don't know what that means. Moreover, land use in Africa has generally been a fallow system, often of the slash and burn type, in which land is cropped for a few years and then abandoned for an extended period to recover its fertility. Thus, agriculture has been on a shifting basis, and peasant life in Africa has been almost as mobile as pastoral activities are, without the permanent localism that is associated with rural villages in Eurasia. Moreover, in Africa, tillage of the soil, usually by digging stick rather than by plow, has tended to be carried on by women, usually wives, and the relationship of the agricultural worker to any exploiter has been a matrimonial or family relationship rather than a relationship that was basically economic, as in Eurasia's serfdom, hired laborer, or plantation slavery. All these features of the basic relationships between men and the land in Africa have restricted the growth of the kind of agrarian superstructure associated with Asiatic despotism and left instead a very amorphous and fluctuating system in which no complex exploitative system could be screwed down on the masses of the people because these were too free to move elsewhere. As a result of this, the kinship groups that are the chief feature of rural Africa are constantly mobile and even today can tell how their common ancestor a few generations back arrived in their residence from some other vague place. Well, yeah, they can move around because it's warm. In like Asia, especially like Northern Asia, it's like you're pretty much stuck in the village because you got to work with everybody just to get like wood and heat and build your house and animal fur and all that stuff. We're in Africa. It's like, oh, this guy's kind of putting the screws on me. I'm just going to walk over there. All right. This mobile and transitory character of native African life has been increased by two other historical features of Africa's past: the pastoral intrusions and slave raiding. The pastoral intrusions arose from the movement into and across Africa of warlike peoples who lived from herds of cattle or horses and imposed their loose rule upon the more peaceful peasant natives. These pastoral intruders have been of two kinds. The first were Bantu cattle herders who derived their way of life from other peoples in northeastern Africa and moved generally south and southwest toward Natal and Angola. These include such savage fighting peoples as the Zulus or the Matabele's of Rhodesia. The second pastoral group has been made up of Arabic or at least Islamized intruders, also from northeastern Africa, who have moved generally westward across Africa with horses. These generally followed the grasslands of the Sudan between the desert and the tropical forest and are found today as dominant and warlike upper classes in many areas such as northern Nigeria. Both groups of pastoral intruders brought in distinctive social and cultural contributions, including new religious ideas, and have enserfed numbers of the African peasants as groups of villages or tribes rather than individuals. The second major force that has traditionally disrupted African life and prevented it from developing any elaborate social hierarchies or long residence linked to specific areas has been the practice of slave raiding, which goes back to ancient Egypt, was carried on by both kinds of pastoral intruders, and culminated in the devastation of much of Africa in the massive slave trade raids of the middle 19th century, such as were witnessed by Dr. Livingstone. The establishment of European colonial rule over Africa, chiefly after 1880, eventually abolished the slave trade and greatly reduced the influence of the pastoral intruders. But this did not decrease the mobility and transitory characteristic of African life, since any increase in rural stability was more than overbalanced by the extension of commerce and the craft manufacturers, which led to a drastic growth of towns and the shattering of many of the kinship structures, such as lineages and tribes. In fact, one of the most obvious problems brought to Africa by European influence has been the detachment of atomized individuals from the social nexus based on blood and marriage that previously guided their lives and determined their system of values and obligations. Each imperial power imposed its own patterns on the people under its colonial dominion, most obviously in the introduction of its own languages. These different patterns and languages remain as dominant forces after independence is achieved, serving to link together the areas with the same colonial past and to separate those with a different colonial experience. In fact, the division of Africa into separate French speaking, English speaking, and Portuguese speaking areas, with all that these differences imply, is now one of the chief obstacles to creation of any major Pan-African unity. In very general terms, we might say that the British impact on its African territories was largely political, the French was cultural, the Belgian was economic, and the Portuguese was religious. The obsession of the upper classes of Britain with government and politics was reflected in their colonial policies, which emphasized the introduction of law and order, introduced political and legal systems based on English models, and educated the minority of the native peoples who obtained education in the politically dominated training provided for the English upper classes. Most educated natives studied political science and law. To this day, ex-British colonial areas show this pattern. The French in Africa talked of their mission civilisation, by which they meant, at a minimum, to offer native peoples the French language with a smattering of French culture. Many natives fell in love with this culture and with Paris, so that when liberation came, they did not, as did the British trained natives, become obsessed with the spirit of political opposition, but rather showed a desire to continue the extension of French cultural life, especially literature, along with political independence. Today, some of the best poetry written in the French language comes from Africans. The Belgians in the Congo rejected any effort to extend political or cultural life to their native peoples, but instead sought to provide them with skills as trained laborers and to build up a prosperous economic basis for a high native standard of living, while at the same time allowing them to get no glimpse of European life, the outside world, political training, or cultural and intellectual ideas. As a result, when independence came to the Congo in 1960, that vast area had one of the highest native standards of living in tropical Africa, but had fewer natives who had attended a university or had even traveled abroad than any French or British territory. The Portuguese were concerned with the conversion of natives to Christianity and with little else, believing that their control of their areas could be maintained best if all other kinds of change were kept minimal. They practiced racial equality and were willing to admit to Portuguese citizenship any native who was individually successful in obtaining a Portuguese education, but on the whole, they did not encourage even this kind of development. The background of the whole process of African decolonization was built up in the wartime and early post-war periods, but the trigger on the chain reaction of the decolonization process was the defeat of the Anglo-French effort at Suez because of American and Soviet pressure in October 1956. As might perhaps be expected, the process began in a British colony, the Gold Coast, now called Ghana. The independence of Ghana was a personal achievement of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who returned to Accra from an educational process in Pennsylvania and the London School of Economics. The year before, in 1946, the Gold Coast obtained the first British African Legislative Assembly that was allowed a majority of Africans. Nkrumah's agitations, including the founding of a new political party, the Convention People's Party, under his own control, earned him a 2-year jail sentence. While he was still in jail, his party won 34 of 38 seats in the assembly in the election of 1951. Therefore, he was released from confinement to take control of the administration. With goodwill on both sides, a transition period of 6 years gave Ghana its independence under Nkrumah's rule in March 1957. Within a year of independence, Nkrumah faced the typical problems of post-colonialism that we have mentioned, a rapid fall in cocoa prices upon which Ghana's international trade position depended, disease in the cocoa trees which required destruction of thousands of trees over the violent protests of their peasant owners, dissension between the pagan, commercial, coastal areas in which the Convention People's Party was based, and the more pastoral Islamic remote interior. Nkrumah soon showed his readiness to handle all problems with ruthless decision. The sick cocoa trees were cut down. Political opponents were silenced in one way or another. Nkrumah was ballyhooed as the father of all Africans, the unique genius of the African Revolution, the mystic symbol of all black men's hopes. A 5-year plan for economic development, 1959 to 1964, promised to spend over $92 million. In 1960, the previous British-granted constitution was replaced by a new Republican constitution that was amended almost at once by a clause allowing Nkrumah to rule without parliament whenever necessary. The leader's Pan-African hopes were reflected in a cause that permitted the surrender of the whole or part of the sovereignty of Ghana to a union of African states. By the end of the same year, political party designations were abolished in Parliament, and the Preventative Detention Act, which allowed Nkrumah to imprison his enemies without charge, was used to arrest the chief members of the political opposition. Ghana embarked on an economic war with the Union of South Africa in protest against the latter's extreme segregation of the races and on a somewhat weaker system of economic reprisals against France in retaliation for its nuclear explosion test in the Sahara. Vigorous activities at the United Nations and African affairs, chiefly in opposition to any Pan-African movement that would not be dominated by Nkrumah, and balancing the two sides of the Cold War while seeking economic aid from both, establishing a Ghana shipping line defiantly called the Black Star Line, and in constructing a gigantic hydroelectric and aluminum manufacturing complex on the Volta River, kept Nkrumah's name in the world's press. Nigeria, the largest territory in the British colonial empire, larger than any European state and 4 times the size of the United Kingdom, with 35 million inhabitants, did not become free until 1960. The delay was caused by the internal divisions within the territory. These were not unexpected, for the territory was an artificial creation cut out of the African wild by Lord Lugar just before World War I. It consisted of 3 regions, North, West, and East, which had no central assembly until 1946 and continued to have diverse interests and attitudes. Each region had a separate government with a joint federal government at Lagos. The northern region is Mohammedan, patriarchal, underdeveloped, poor, ignorant, and feudal, ruled by an aristocratic upper group of emirs descended from pastoral conquerors. The western region is small but rich and thickly populated with progressive agriculturalists, chiefly Yoruba. The eastern region, dominated by the Igbo peoples, tend to dominate the whole federation. There are tribal and religious differences between the 3, since the South is pagan and the government of the Federation must be by coalition of 2 religions against the 3rd. American educated Dr. Nemadi Azikiwe, known as Zik, was the first governor general functioning as president and the dominant political figure from the eastern region, while the prime minister, Sir Abukar Tafawa Balewa, was Muslim from the northern region. The opposition was led by Chief Obafemi Awolowo Awolowo of the western region. This rather precarious balance of forces was stabilized by the strength of the English-speaking tradition of moderation and rule of law, both much more securely established in Nigeria than in Ghana, and by the industrious, alert, and balanced character of Nigeria's chief tribal groups. The economy was also better balanced than that of many African states, with a productive agriculture as well as varied mineral resources. The key to Africa's future may rest with the success of former French Africa, since this group seems to provide a nucleus on which the more moderate forces on the continent may congregate. The chief difficulty from which they suffer is that most are arid and all are poor, compared to the Congo or Nigeria. The impact of war was much more significant in French Africa than in British Africa because of the defeat of France and the fact that the supporters of de Gaulle's resistance rather than of Petain's pseudo-fascism controlled these territories during much of the war. Such control could be sustained only with the support of the African population, which was loyally given, although few rewards came in return for more than a decade after the war. Then freedom came swiftly, in sequence to the military disasters in Indochina in 1954 and the rising disaster in Algeria, rather than from the events or struggles in Black Africa itself. The first effort was not towards independence, but towards closer union with France by incorporating the African territories in an elaborate federal structure. The French Union, which gave the Africans representation and even cabinet post in Paris. One of the incidental consequences of this largely transitory structure was that the neutralism of the African end of the structure tended to spread to the metropolitan end of Paris. At the same time, American support of independence for colonial areas at a time when Paris was seeking to strengthen its African connections was one in a series of American actions that drove France, and especially de Gaulle, towards a neutral position for Paris itself. The French Union was still in process of being established in 1958, after having lost Indochina in 1954, Morocco and Tunis in 1956, when the Fourth French Republic disintegrated beneath the strain of the Algerian crisis, and de Gaulle came in with his constitution for the Fifth Republic. This provided a federal system by which essential powers were reserved to the central authority and other powers developed upon the autonomous member states. The key community functions reserved to France included foreign affairs, defense, currency, common economic and financial policy, control of strategic materials, and, with certain exceptions, higher education, justice, external transportation, and communications. The new constitution was presented to the overseas areas of France with the opportunity to accept or reject it, but with little expectation that any area would reject it because of their need for French economic, air, and other expenditures of federal funds. Sékou Touré of Guinea, however, persuaded his area to vote against ratification and was, in retaliation by de Gaulle, instantly rejected from the French community and its political and financial support. About $20 million a year was stopped. The newly independent and outcast area sought support in Moscow, spreading panic in other capitals at this opening of the African scene to Soviet penetration. For about 5 years, Guinea sought an alternative to the French system, established an authoritarian, one-party leftist regime, signed an act of union with Ghana, a meaningless agreement that brought Toure a $28 million loan from Nkrumah, and welcomed Soviet aid and communist technicians to Conakry. Guinea recognized East Germany, welcomed influences from Red China, accepted American offers of counteraid, and nationalized all schools, churches, and many French-owned business enterprises. For a while, a possible union of Ghana, Guinea, and the Mali Republic, former French Sudan, signed in 1961, threatened to form a union of African states, but this hope faded along with the anticipation of any substantial Soviet aid or assistance, and Guinea by 1963 was in process of working its way back into the French African system. The Guinea exodus from the French community in 1958, regretted by both sides within a few years, opened the way to independence for all French Africa. Senegal and the Sudanese Republic, linked together briefly as the Mali Republic, obtained freedom in April 1960 and started a flood of declarations of independence led by Madagascar. This political disintegration of the French areas in Africa raised at once two acute problems. One, what would be their relationship with France, a connection that had brought French Africa over $2 billion in French development funds in the 1947 to 1958 period, and two, what arrangements could be made between the newly independent states to prevent the balkanization of Africa, with its resulting inability to handle problems of transportation, communications, public health, river development, and such which transcend small local areas. To answer this first question, a French constitutional law of June 1960 changed the French community to a contractual association. 14 French African states signed a multitude of individual agreements with France that recognized their full sovereignty on the international scene, but established cooperation with France over a wide range of economic, financial, cultural, and political relationships. Thus, by voluntary agreement, French control along the general lines of the existing status quo was preserved. The effort to prevent balkanization by some sort of federal arrangement for the French African areas was prevented by the objections of Ivory Coast and Gabon. The former was the wealthiest of the 8 French West African states, while Gabon was the richest of the 4 French Equatorial African states. This opposition broke up the Mali Union of Senegal and Sudan in 1960, and the latter, taking the name Mali itself, drifted off towards cooperation with Guinea. This disintegration of French Africa was stopped only because of growing anxiety at the efforts of Ghana's Nkrumah to form an opposed Pan-African bloc of a leftist tinge. This effort gave rise to the Union of Independent African States and the All African Peoples Conferences. The Union of Independent African States arose from the Pan-African dreams of the late George Padmore and was organized by him for Nkrumah. Its first meeting at Accra on April 1958 had representatives of the 8 states then independent in Africa: Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, and the United Arab Republic. They demanded an end to French military operations in Algeria and immediate independence for all American territories. 3 subsequent meetings in 1959 to 1960 advanced no further except to attack the establishment of racial segregation, apartheid in South Africa, and Nigeria blocked efforts to take immediate steps towards a United States of Africa in June 1960. The All-African Peoples Conference, also sponsored by Nkrumah, were great mass conventions of labor unions, youth groups, political parties, and other organizations from all Africa, including non-independent areas. They achieved little beyond the usual denunciations of colonialism, apartheid, and the Algerian War. 3 of these conferences were held at Accra, Tunis, and Conakry in 1958 to 1960. In opposition to these Ghana-inspired movements in late 1960, Dr. Felix Houphouet Boigny, the political leader of the Ivory Coast, one-time French cabinet minister and French spokesman at the United Nations, took steps to organize a French-centered Union of African States called the Brazzaville 12. After their second meeting at Brazzaville, French Congo, in December 1960, these formed a loose organization for cooperation and parallel action in Africa, the United Nations, and the world. In the United Nations, they established a bloc to vote as a unit from October 1960. At the same time, they began to work closely as a group with a number of technical, economic, educational, and research organizations that had grown up under the United Nations or with international sponsorship to deal with African problems. Of the large number of these, we need mention only the Commission for Technical Cooperation in Africa south of the Sahara, head office in London, and its advisory council, the Scientific Council for African south of the Sahara, the head office in Belgian Congo, the Foundation for Mutual Assistance in Africa south of the Sahara, office in Accra. As we have said, the Ghana-Guinea Union of May 1959 was expanded with the accession of Mali in July 1961 into the pompously named Union of African States, UAS. At Brazzaville in December 1960, 6 French territories of West Africa and 4 of Equatorial Africa joined with the Cameroon Federation and the Malagasy Republic to form the Brazzaville 12, officially entitled Union of Africa and Malagasy States, or the UAMS. At a conference at Casablanca in January 1961, the UAS moved a step further by forming rather tenuous links with Morocco, the United Arab Republic, and the Provisional Government of Algeria. 4 months later, at Monrovia, the UAMS formed a more stable and homogeneous grouping of 20 by adding to the Brazzaville group Liberia, Nigeria, Togo, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Somalia, Libya, which had previously been at Casablanca, and Tunisia. This represented a considerable victory over the UAS group and was the result of several influences. A number of African leaders, led by President Tubman of Liberia, objected to Nkrumah's efforts to introduce the Cold War into Africa and to his extravagant propaganda, controversy, and cult of personality within the African context. Moreover, the Casablanca grouping was paralyzed by the rivalry between Nkrumah and Nasser and by the non-African organization of the Muslim North African members who constantly sought to drag the African states into non-African issues such as the Arab hatred of Israel. The UAMS group has eschewed these issues, has sought to avoid controversy and propaganda, and has played down the anti-imperialist, anti-Portuguese, anti-South African issues which rouse such enthusiasm but achieve so little in mass assemblies of Africans. The UAMS also, unlike the UAS group, has rejected any efforts to interfere in the domestic affairs of its African members and neighbors. Instead, it has tended to work quietly on rather technical questions and has been satisfied with moderate agreements. Its chief meetings, usually twice a year, have assembled the chiefs of the member states with a different host city on each occasion. Agreements reached at these high-level conferences are then generally implemented by subsequent meetings of specialized or technical experts. The union's concerns have been economic and social rather than political or ideological, and its approach to its problems has been generally conciliatory, tolerant, empirical, relatively democratic, pro-Western, and, above all, tentative. Most of its achievements have resulted from months of careful testing of the ground and have usually been considered at several of its summit conferences. Its Charter of Union, for example, was not signed until the fourth conference at Tana Narrative in September 1961. Its mechanisms of operation, beyond the semi-annual meetings of chiefs of state, consist of a secretariat and a secretary-general at Cotonou, Dahomey, a defense union consisting of a council of the 12 defensive ministers and a general staff and military secretariat at Ouagadougou, Volta, the Organization of African Malagasy Economic Cooperation Station at Yaoundé, Cameroon, and African Malagasy Union of Posts and Telecommunications, consisting of the 12 ministers concerned with these and a central office at Brazzaville, a joint Air Afrique airline associated with Air France, and other similar organizations concerned with development, shipping, research, and other activities. Several agreements have been signed establishing judicial, financial, and commercial cooperation. The whole system has an independent budget financed by a fixed percentage grant from each state's budget to the common fund. The whole relationship has formed the chief element of stability in African problems, has retained its close contacts with France, and has formed the core of a moderate group among the growing multitude of neutrals at the United Nations. Its possible implications for the future political organization of Africa, if not for a wider area, will be considered in the next chapter. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there because it's the next chapter. Getting close. Next chapter is going to be chapter 20, Tragedy and Hope, the Future in Perspective. All right. So we can see from that chapter that Africa just had a lot of problems post-colonialization, from the language groups and the different cultures, and the fact that they did the same thing they did in like India and Pakistan, where they just drew lines through tribes and through different groups of people and separated them into different countries that didn't exist. They didn't really have any concept of this, so the whole thing just kind of messed up their society. Then they're trying to play catch up with European education, European technology, and we know there's some differences between Africans and Europeans, so that kind of was a problem. And really, it seems like that's about it. It's like the advancing Africa into the modernization, like they did all the other countries, just seems to be taking a lot of effort. The fact that people can just move around, they were never used to living in like cities or villages or things like that in a permanent state, kind of also messes things up too. So a lot of problems there, a lot of problems, but we can see that. So yeah, That's it for the video today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.